Feared and hated across the wasteland, ghouls are somewhat iconic to the post-war world of Fallout. A living reminder of how far the post-war world has fallen since human beings can devolve into such twisted creatures. As such, ghouls both feral and non-feral aren't super well treated in the world after the bombs fell. But did you know that ghoulification was not a uniquely post-war phenomenon caused by the Great War, but instead a clandestine condition that many pre-war people in power already knew about? So today, let's take a look at the few ghouls who were shambling the earth when it looked more like a picnic than a graveyard. First off the block is Desmond Lockheart. A veritable James Bond in his pre-war heyday, Desmond is a ghoul located in Point Lookout, locked in conflict with a pre-war adversary named Professor Calvert. Desmond is described as having been a high-stakes player in pre-war international intelligence, evidently in Her Majesty's service. In fact, so high up in the echelons of international relations was Desmond that he'd known for quite a long time that the Great War was coming. The exact date was unknown, but he and his fellow peers and rivals had a better estimate of this than anyone else barring Mr. House. As such, Desmond and his peers all sought to survive the Great War in some form or another. Some, such as the previously mentioned Professor Calvert, extracted his brain and placed it in a jar. Mr. House, in a similar vein, placed his physical body in stasis while connecting his mind to his network to become more than his physical self. Desmond, in contrast, preferred to remain as close to his former self as possible. Utilizing his connections in the pre-war scientific community, he learned of the opportunities afforded by exposing the human body to lethal but controlled doses of radiation. In the early months of 2077, Desmond opted for the procedure. The radiation flowed through his cells, mutating them, yet not enough to kill them outright. His body began to deteriorate, flesh and nails falling off his withered shell, yet he remained alive. In contrast to his rivals, he remained whole and mostly intact, still retaining his original body, rather than becoming a hideous brain in a jar. And most importantly for the one-time ladykiller, he retained his hair and his mustache. For the remaining months of 2077, a ghoulified Desmond spent his remaining time in the pre-war world preparing for the one to come. And as the bombs eventually fell around him as predicted, Desmond hunkered down in safety, ready and waiting for the next chapter of this new world. For Desmond, the Great War was a minor blip in what he calls the Great Game, his ghoulification process a mere necessity in being able to continue to play the game and one day emerge as its victor. Research Assistant Peters was a pre-war scientist dedicated to the creation of radiation treatment. In an effort to help mankind in the event of atomic warfare, Peters willingly volunteered to be exposed to radiation in the bid to perfect the treatment, labelled as Serum Sample 42BA7. The plan was relatively straightforward. Research Assistant Peters was to be exposed to approximately 600 levels of rads, record the effects it had on her body, and then inject herself with the serum before the dosage became lethal. So nobly, on the 26th of February 2077, she began to record the effects after having 2 doses of radiation on her body. In her first recording, she outlined the pain in her frontal and parietal lobes, nausea, weakness in limbs, bleeding of gums, and the possibility of intestinal bleeding. In her words, she had never felt as horrible as she did in that moment. Heroically, although wishing to stop the program, she continued on. On the 1st of March, she recorded that she had tissue damage on her arms, neck, and hand, with self-described necrotic sloughing of the skin. Having administered the full 600 dosage of radiation, she injected herself with the serum, hopeful to begin recording the reversal process. Tragically, Peters' goodwill had been used against her. The director of the program had not informed her that she was in the trial's control group, with the serum given to her not being serum at all, but a placebo instead. Peters' role was merely for the scientists to examine the effects this level of severe radiation would have on an individual when left uncontrolled. In her final recording, Peters outlined further necrotic tissue damage. In particular, her teeth had begun to dislodge, while her skin continued to fall off her body like wallpaper. Peters asked for Dr. Roberts, the director of the program, to give the holotapes to her family, telling them that she loved them, she volunteered for the program, and had only hoped to help people with the possibility of making a viable serum. We do not quite know the fate of research assistant Peters. The holotapes themselves are found within her family's home in Charleston, indicating that the director of the program honoured her wish to provide them to them. Ironically, it appears her family also became ghouls, given that the house is infested with them, with a particularly strong glowing one located in the attic. Peters was evidently more than halfway through the ghoulification process at the time of her last recording. Physically, she had mirrored a ghoul, but her mind was still sane, so it's imagined she was the equivalent to a non-feral ghoul. However, it's doubtful that she survived the procedure outright. Either she would have succumbed to the radiation, or it's imagined that the director would have eliminated her once she became a full ghoul. Eddie Winters was a pre-war crime lord who terrorized Boston in his heyday. So terrible was his rule that even after the bombs fell, a surviving wastelander commented that post-war Appalachia is safer than a pre-war Boston under Winters' rule. Eddie Winters held enormous respect and power in Boston. He was virtually untouchable. Not even by his fellow crims who paid homage and tax to him as per his station, but not even by the police force, whom Winters obtained complete immunity from prosecution with by snitching on his associates, but not before killing the family of said police officers. Yet despite it all, Eddie aspired to be more than a mafioso don in Boston. Eddie's reach and connections went extremely deep, even all the way to high levels in the pre-war US military. A particular officer that Eddie labelled his cloak and dagger army intelligence friend tipped Eddie off about the upcoming projected timeline for what came to be known as the Great War. It's imagined that this information came from the same network that fellow pre-war ghoul Desmond Lockheart operated out of. With all the money he had acquired, Eddie sought to prepare and not just survive the Great War, but thrive in it. He firstly built an elaborate fallout shelter, not only for himself but for his pre-war mistress, stocked with amenities. Most importantly, however, Eddie turned himself into a ghoul. In a tape recorded well before the Great War, Eddie laid out his plan to his mistress. Having requisitioned radioactive material from smugglers, Eddie underwent treatment with a pre-war Boston doctor who had been conducting research on the right kind of radiation exposure at the right amounts to be able to change human cells. It seems that the knowledge on ghoulification was quite well spread in the pre-war medical community. Eddie evidently survived the treatment and was a ghoul at the time of the recording, prepping his partner that he might look a little bit different now, but love was only skin deep, right? Eddie declared that once the war was over, he was going to own the future of Boston. Eddie evidently did survive 200 years into the future in his new form. However, it does not seem like he really did much other than hide in his bunker, until Nick Valentine and the sole survivor came to invoke retribution for the pre-war murder of Nick's fiancée. Eddie was perhaps the first ghoul in existence, or at least the first that we have documentable evidence for, given the fact that his recording alluded to him starting to undergo treatments of ghoulification, at least in the year of 2076, a full year before the Great War. Other examples of pre-war ghouls are less named individuals, but areas we can stumble upon post-war that seem to indicate that they knew about the process in pre-war times. The Mechanist occupies a United States of America robotics technology facility that was dedicated to the creation of robo-brains. To this end, criminals were incarcerated, experimented upon, and vivisected to form the robo-brains that we see in the waste today. However, it appears evident that some of the experiments may have deviated from this initial process. The prisoners are still able to be found in their cells, all having become ghouls. Some are even still alive, if you can call it that. While it could be argued that they're simply the prisoners who transformed after the Great War, a few other points beg to differ. For one, the ghouls can be found strapped into trolley beds in the location. Again, perhaps the prisoners had been strapped here as human, but then they later turned. However, at least 2 ghouls can be found in a tank of fluid on site, dead and drowned in the substance. If these 2 had been placed in here as humans prior to the bombs falling, they never would have turned at all. They would have simply died. Although separate from the ghouls, X-rays of death claws can also be found within the same lab, suggesting that the pre-war scientists here were prepped in some form or another for what beings in the post-war world may be. Lastly, while this is not an example per se of an individual who was a ghoul prior to the Great War, there is the possibility that there were some others. As mentioned before, medical scientists evidently understood the process well enough to perform radiation therapy on Desmond and Eddie Winter to purposefully transform them into ghouls. It can therefore be imagined that the secret was one rather well known in the pre-war scientific community, but one that came only with a very high price. While he is a post-war ghoul, Hancock stated that he had become a ghoul after ingesting a one-of-a-kind radiation drug that was created in pre-war times. Hancock evidently knew, or at least strongly suspected, that the outcome of the drug would result in ghoulification, given the claims that he wanted to have a new face to no longer look at his old one. It can therefore be theorized that the medical community knew of the ghoulification process, but like many luxuries of the post-war world, the drugs and medical tech available were only for the 1% of the 1% of wealthiest individuals. Therefore, although 99% of ghouls were created due to the immediate atomic blast caused by the Great War, the process itself was one that pre-war governments and powerful entities did know all about. However, at the time, the conditions to create such organisms were limited. One, the amount of radiation required to transform an individual was something that most either did not have access to or just did not want to do so. And two, test subjects willing and unwilling were few and far between, all for an outcome that was not yet fully understood. However, the mutation that would transform a human being into a ghoul must have been something that lay dormant for quite some time in human DNA, and it looks like all it needed was one big blast, or maybe a few very clever pre-war scientists to unlock its potential. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed, and I'll see you around like a risol.